The title of this presentation is Building an Automated Test Team or Architecting the Best Test Team. Several titles, but basically it's an overview of a program that we're implementing with several customers that we're putting out there as a way to build a great automated test team. So any questions, post them in the chat. We're monitoring that. I can see the chat, so if you see me look up like that, I'm watching the chat there. Yeah, feel free to ask any questions at any time. So let's get started. First things first, our giants are female, highlighting Alice Ball. She lives kind of a shorter life, but she had a master's from the University of Hawaii, and she was a chemistry professor there. And she did some groundbreaking stuff with leprosy, which seems odd that was even an issue not that long ago. It's modern medicine is modern. Oddly, the president of the university tried to take credit for all of her work because she died so suddenly, and but then other people voiced their concerns and gave her the right credit for her work. So moving on. Today we're going to be talking about, like I said, the Test Team Builder program. We're going to talk about overview. We're going to talk about our mission, some disciplines, the process, and then the value add to your team. So first things first, TestRact is the name of the company, but TestPoint is a brand that we use for training and building teams and different things like that. So the reason I started TestRact was to solve the resource issue, really, that exists in the test and measurement world. And there's really two ways you can solve that resource issue. You can create new, better resources, or you can make existing resources more efficient. And so TestRact side of the house is for creating tools and things that make test development faster, better, cheaper, right? And then TestPoint is the brand that we use for creating new resources or creating better resources or developing talent within the test and measurement world. And you can go to our website, testpointacademy.com, which we'll have a link at the end of the presentation. But it's really dedicated to growing and training and onboarding in the test and measurement community. So I'm Sam Roundy. I'm the president of TestRact. I've been doing this about 20 years. I do a lot on the Testan forums. I'm a big Testan user. I do a lot with LabVIEW. I am a certified professional instructor. Steve Evans, who's sitting here in the room with me, he is an instructional design wizard and a talent development wizard. He's been doing it for 20 years. He's worked in government. He's worked in the commercial world. He's worked in the academia. So he's got awards for doing training, onboarding, a lot of different things like that. So good stuff.
Yep, happy to be here. So Sam and I were talking about this presentation. We wanted to at least kick things off with why the focus on team development. And I think a lot of you in the session today hopefully are either interested in that or realize that it's a pretty big deal, that there's been a huge uptick in a focus on team development, on individual growth, and on investing in people to ensure organizational success. And that some of the problems that we see, at least with test organizations, is that those teams are often neglected. I actually have a family member that worked for a government contractor for his entire career, 40 plus years. And he was in test for part of that organization, or part of that time with that organization, and told me about how many times he was just moved around from team to team and place to place because test was always, the afterthought. So those teams often do get neglected, and as Sam mentioned, there's a lack of internal resources and opportunity costs associated with replacing those resources is often very, very high. And so as Sam mentioned, that's why we focused on creating Test Point Academy to help solve some of those problems.
Awesome. So specifically, the Test Team Builder program, we've identified basically 6 disciplines that contribute to creating a rock star team, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about the 4 steps of the process to get there. But these 6 disciplines need to be focused on as a team. I mean, some teams do some of these better than others, and you can have a good team and ignore some of these things. But a great team, I think, you really need to focus on all 6 of these. And so let's go through each one of those disciplines in a little more detail. The first one being your processes. Your processes are important. They drive how you get work product through your organization. They're how you create your test plans, your test procedures, your hardware, your software. They're how you create everything. It's how you distribute that knowledge to your developers. And I've learned if you don't have a good process, and I've seen this with a lot of organizations, teams will just kind of, or individuals on teams will just kind of meander and kind of do their own thing, and everyone has their own way of doing things, and it causes a lot of chaos, a lot of slowdowns. If you have a very well-defined process, your engineers can look at that and they can say, I know exactly how I'm supposed to work. And it's a step-by-step thing, and they can see, okay, this is the next step in the process. This is what I need to be focused on next, as opposed to just whatever the next shiny thing is, or just however they want to accomplish it, right? so process, and we'll talk a little bit about how to create that process later on in this presentation. The next discipline is your organization, how you're organized as a team. I think that plays a huge role in doing things properly. You want to give the right people the authority to make the decisions, and we'll talk about this a little later. But the big thing here, I think, that you can take away from this team organization is that decision-making ability, that you can delegate things to certain team members. Decisions by committee are super expensive. They take a long time, and they slow you down, and they cost a lot, right? And so having the right organization, the right delegation, the right people in the right seats is very important in accomplishing things quickly and effectively, right? So the third one here is project management. This tends to be overlooked a lot in our industry, in the test and measurement world. Are you using the right tools? What systems are you using? How do you track it? How do you hold people accountable for their projects? And it also helps with planning properly on your team for doing resource management. A lot of times we treat test and measurement as a black hole, where we assign Bob or Joe, go write this test procedure or go put together this test station. We rarely check in on them. We just assume that they're doing their work. 12 months later, they might produce something, hopefully. And usually that's when orgs find out that they're grossly behind on projects, and they need to call in the support units to get back on track. I've seen that way too often in our industry, where we get called in a lot at the end of projects where they just haven't made the progress. And I think that's due to improper project management and poor planning there. So the fourth discipline is software. Software is, so not all organizations, I guess, that are in test and measurement write software, but the ones that do, this is critical. So do you have a framework? Do you have a hardware abstraction layer? Do you have a test executive? Do you have a development, model? Do you use source code control? These kinds of things. If you're following these proficiencies properly, you're going to have a lot better quality software. And these practices are very important to producing good software. I've seen way too many times where orgs have written static, code that takes a lot to maintain, or overcomplicated the software to where it takes a certain high level of skill to maintain the software, or they're not following the source code control, rules, and they've only got a copy of the source code on on Joe's machine, and Joe leaves the company, and IT wipes his machine, and you lost all your source code. So implementing a lot of these practices is important. Hardware, there's a lot of proficiencies, what instruments you choose, how you communicate with your unit under test, what cables you use, calibration, test fixtures, how you manage that. And then there's things like building test fixtures. Do you need the ability on your team to build test fixtures, to do soldering, to do mechanical work? And so later when we talk about applying this, we'll look at those skill sets and what skills you identify on your team as needing, and how you can acquire those skills, or do you outsource those skills because you just don't do it enough? And so hardware is an important one. Individual growth, the last discipline, and I think one of the more important ones that often gets neglected, because there's such a high attrition rate in the test and measurement world. I think that I was reading the other day, there's a group called Zippia that did a study on test and measurement, and I think they said 31% of engineers who go into this discipline leave within the first year. That's huge. That's
and another almost 30% leave by the end of their second year. So
yeah, that's
it was
almost
like 57%, I think, total within their first 2 years.
Yeah, that's high attrition, and I think that I think that's partly because there's not really a good definition of career growth in the test and measurement world. A lot of us are self-taught, or we work for a company that's all they focus on, and so we learned that skill through that company. But I think having training programs, onboarding programs, mentoring, properly, and giving the proper skills and growth in this area is important, because, like I said, you're going to have high attrition. When people feel vested in, they're going to stick around, because engineers want to grow. They want to feel like they're growing, right? So, cool. Are there any questions before we move on? Thoughts? Andrew, a standard methodology that all members can understand and support. Yes.
Yeah, so the benefits of these disciplines is really just to break down all work, or categorize all the work that goes into test and measurement.
And having a rock star team, right?
Exactly.
So we have this test team builder program, and there's kind of 4 stages here. There's the assess, the strategize, the act, and the maintain. And so we're gonna look at each one of those steps. And so when we engage with our customers, this is kind of the process that we work with them on. We consult with them on are these 4 steps. And even within your own organization, you can look at these and say, okay, are we, how would we assess our team? How would we strategize for our team? And so assess is the first one. We have an initial assessment, which is like 20 questions. That's online. It's just kind of a pulse check, to see where your team is with those 6 disciplines. And that's a really simple thing. And then the second one is this formal assessment, where we engage a little deeper with our customers, and we go through those 6 disciplines super detailed, questionnaires. We sit down, we interview key members of their team, technical members, technicians, high-level management. We observe things. We go through their documents. We do document reviews. We look at how they do, those 6 disciplines in more detail. What does their software process look like? Where are they storing their source code? And we give scores based on those things. And the output of this process is a scorecard. So it looks something like this.
Right. So the benefit of having a scorecard like this, not only does it create awareness around where sort of opportunities are for improvement, but it helps, I think, generate that desire as well. Ideally, our scorecard, as you can see, is broken out by our 6 disciplines, and then there are details we'll show you in a second that we dive a lot deeper. The scorecard is, again, meant to show where you rank compared to industry standards, compared to the overall test point standard across these domains or those disciplines. And as an example of the detailed scorecard, so for example, in software, it's the categories that Sam was mentioning are those proficiencies related to framework, the hardware extraction layer, the test executive development model, source code control. These are just a few examples that we like to illustrate. And as you can see, there's opportunities. So as we go through and assess the organization, which leads into the next step of kind of creating that plan through our strategizing efforts, this assessment just helps you pinpoint where you need to focus and where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck.
So, yeah, to Steve's point, for example, with source code control, if you're loosely doing it or one of your individuals is doing it, nobody else is following it, you might get a super low score there, right? Whereas we have a high standard where we say, okay, you need to be doing these things with source code control. Before anyone checks any code in, they have to review. Before, how well do you understand branching? How well do you understand tags? Do you do continuous integration? What does that look like? And so we have a certain scores that we attach to source code control and how we analyze that and we look at that. So same with your hardware abstraction layer or your overall test executive or your framework or your development model. We look at those in depth and we have kind of things that we feel like are best practices. And then we kind of also look at the industry based on teams and different things that we've worked with and polls that we put out there. And we say, well, the industry is kind of here, but we think, this is what the standard should look like. So any questions on this before we move on?
And by the way, I'm monitoring the chat, so if at any time you have questions, just drop them in the chat. I don't believe people can speak up, so to speak, but we'll watch that chat and answer your questions as they come in. Cool. So after that assessment phase, we have those scorecards, and then we go into the strategize phase. And the first step of the strategize phase is to identify that process. What does your main flow look like? And we'll look at that in just a little more detail here in a minute. But what kind of work comes in and what do you produce, or what kind of work goes out of your org, and what does that process look like through your organization, right? And you might identify multiple processes, right? For example, you have your main flow where you get your requirements either from R&D or from some other entity, and those requirements are basically, you need to create a test station to test the unit under test, and here's what that looks like. And you're going to produce a test set with software that does X, Y, and Z, and that's your output, right? And you might have milestones in there, but you might have a simpler process for maintaining or the production floor has an issue with this test station, you need to go fix it. And you might have a super simple process for that. And how much of your work is maintenance versus how much of it is focused on your main flow process. And so you're identifying a lot of what your day-to-day activities
are really with this step of the process. And then you identify your needs. So once you have that kind of ideal flow identified, then you sit down and you go through the 6 disciplines and you say, okay, what are our needs? Maybe your team doesn't do any software. Maybe your team is software only and you don't do any hardware. Or, I think every team needs to have some kind of project management, individual growth, team organization, and processes. That I don't think those ones are escapable, but maybe these other 2 might be, right? So, and then you prioritize and assign an ROI, like who, when, how much, how are we going to get there? What does that look like? And so the ultimate goal of this test team builder is to really build a rock star team, a world-class team, a center of excellence, if you will. And so the output of this phase, the strategize phase, is to have an action plan on how you're going to implement all of those things. So let's dive a little deeper into this. So maybe the first step is to identify your main process, identify what documents you need, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, identify any of your sub-processes, make all of these documents accessible that drive your team, right? And you're gonna once you identify this process, you're gonna be able to identify roles and responsibilities and all of that. So for example, maybe you come up with a process that looks something like this, where you have a planning phase, you have an architecture phase, you have a development phase, an integration phase, a maintenance phase. Your inputs to each one of these can be identified. So before we can even plan for a project, we have to know the requirements. We want to have the design documents for the unit under test. We want the ICD. We want to know what contacts are out there, right? Who's your customer? What do those contacts look like? Maybe your customer is a team in R&D, and you want to identify the people in R&D that you need to contact that have that have designed this unit under test, so that you can go to them and if you have additional questions during your planning phase. The outputs of this planning phase might be a test plan or test requirements, because in test and measurement, we learn very quickly that the requirements that a customer gives us are not the exact requirements that we test to. Those change. And sometimes I've been in an org where we call that requirement shredding, where we turn those requirements that we get from the customer into the actual test requirements. Here's the actual specs that we're going to test this unit under test to, even though the current draw up here says, it can't load this much. It can't load more than this much current. Maybe you have a different requirement for testing and you have a tighter spec there in tests, so that you can make sure that you're over meeting that customer need, right? And so the output should also have risks identified, and we have template documents for a lot of this stuff, for doing a lot of this stuff. And then one of the milestones is like a kickoff meeting, where at the end of this you have a kickoff with all of the interested parties. And sometimes we've seen where groups will have the planning and the architecture phase together, and they'll hold a kickoff or a preliminary design review together. And they'll have all their architecture documents ready. Now, I recommend you kind of have separate ones, because this planning phase is where you can ask a lot of the preliminary questions, whereas this architecture phase, you can dive deep and you can ask a lot of the very specific questions about the unit under test or what you're actually building. And then you can output a lot of these documents, right? And then you might identify the inputs and the outputs for your development phase. For example, what tools are we going to use? And maybe your organization already has that defined. We absolutely use LabVIEW and TestStand, or maybe you say we are a Python house, we only use Python. But one thing I should mention about this whole process here and coming up with this process, your goal as a team should be to eliminate as many decisions as possible, so that when you get to these different phases, a lot of those decisions are already made. Like, here's the style guide we're going to use. That's a team standard that we have in place, and everyone has to adhere to that. We do peer reviews this way, and everyone has to adhere to those. And if you can make a lot of those decisions one time instead of every time you go through a development process. It's going to be much cheaper, much faster, much better process, right? So the goal of this is to really identify that high level process for your team, what that looks like, and how you get through that, so that you can then identify things like your team. What kind of team do I even need, right? What skills do I need on my team? And so you list all of those functions that you're going to do. So you take this test process, whatever that looks like, and you list all of the functions that have to happen during that process. Oh, we need to write a test plan. We need to write this document. We need to actually develop the code. We need to hold peer reviews. And you can start creating roles specific to those functions. For example, you might have a software architect or a project lead or a technician who does the maintenance of the test set, or you need a hardware architect to do the architecture of the test fixtures or the mechanical stuff, right? You might need a mechanical guy. By doing that, you can start to really define the roles that you need inside of your organization, and those roles can then be assigned. I don't know if you guys have heard of like a RACI chart, or at L3 Harris, when I worked there, we called it a dot chart. But basically, once you've identified those roles, you can give them decision-making power. And so the way that this works is each line would be something that you perform, one of those functions, if you will, like holding reviews or holding, responsible for beta testing and customer integration. And then you assign a colored dot in this specific example. And you don't have to use a dot chart or a RACI chart. You can come up with another way to give power to people, essentially. And that's the whole goal of this, is to give power to certain individuals. And so, for example, you have kind of three dots. You have a red dot, a green dot, and a blue dot. The green dot is the decision maker. They own that decision. The blue dots are required inputs, and the red dot means that they have the veto power. So if one of the blue dots raises concern about the decisions that the green dot is making, then the red dot would get involved at that point.
Yeah, so really the whole focus initially on processes related to your work product is so that we can help you build that team that's going to be the most efficient and yet the most productive, but also one that is going to last throughout your organization, right? Not just a quick and dirty, we're going to set this team up and boom, they're going to be done. We want to help you build that organization and create that culture that really is pervasive. Yeah.
The idea behind the dot chart is so that you can make decisions quicker, and so that the owner of that decision can just, go, essentially. I've seen way too much time wasted in meetings where decisions are trying to be made by committee because they don't want to hurt certain people's feelings. So they have to include them in the decision. I always laugh at that. It's like, this is a business. Leave your egos at the door, leave your emotions at the door. It's hard to say that in today's world, but at the end of the day, you put someone in that position that you trust, you give them the authority to make those decisions, and they should be able to own that and make those decisions. And that will greatly speed up your process. It's okay if they make the wrong decisions. You can just fix it. They're going to make a couple wrong decisions here and there. That's okay. It's easier to fix those than it is to never make a decision at all. So, yeah. Any questions on that? So now that you have your flow together, your flow, your process together, now you can talk about project management. You can go look at that process that you've put together, and you can say, okay, well, we need to track these things in Jira. or Monday.com or whatever you're using to track your projects, right? And you can put your workflows together inside of those tools pretty easily because you can just have that match your process. You can identify different metrics that you're gonna take along the way. You know, we want to calculate how many peer reviews were held on these things, or we want to calculate, you know, how many hours were spent on these types of activities. And you can start to track those metrics better. Having that scorecard is going to help you make better decisions with your team, or focus on areas that you can improve, right? So for example, if you're finding that, hey, why is it taking 10 weeks to write an architecture document? Every project we get, it takes like 10 to 15 weeks. What's going on? And you can sit down, you can analyze that specifically and see, you know, oh, well, if we templatized this, or we did this or that and tweaked this, we can speed that up dramatically. And so understanding the metrics behind, first of all, you got to gather the data, and having that data, and you can then have those metrics to make smarter decisions, to get more efficient. Or you might realize that, hey, why is Joe always taking 300 hours to do this certain thing, but everybody else only takes 50? Well, maybe Joe just doesn't have the right skills to perform. And so you can look at that as an opportunity to bring in training for Joe, or is he the right fit, or you know, having those metrics in that scorecard is really important to being more efficient, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Software, we have a framework assessment tool that we use with a lot of our customers, and this is meant to find gaps in your existing framework. We look for things like how well it's documented, the ease of development. What does a developer process look like, or a developer, you know, experience look like? Do they have to have crazy off the chart skills to even work on this team, or is it simplistic enough that, you know, we can take your average run of the mill developer and they can pick it up pretty quickly, right? We had an experience with one of our customers where another entity had came in and stood up a very complex actor framework solution for them. It took their guys 5 to 6 months to just learn how to use that framework. And then when they wanted to do simple type maintenance things, it would take another month or two just to get some of those fixes in there. It was a very powerful framework, but it was too complex for that team. That team didn't have the skill set to support it. They didn't want to develop the skill set to support it. So we simplified that dramatically for them, and now they're using a simpler framework that meets their needs a lot better. So what is your end user experience? And these are things that we look at in that assessment is what does the end user experience as they're executing tests with the software? Do they have the data that they need? Where's the data stored? Do they have the right analytical tools? What does your hardware abstraction look like? What does your process look like for developing software and developing the framework? How simple is that, you know? And then the other things that you would look at is well, we recommend 1, maybe 2 languages, programming languages. We see a lot of orgs where they just hire people and they let them go to town on whatever language they know. And then you end up with like 10 different languages in your organization. It's really hard to maintain, but it's even harder to move developers from different projects, because if you have a Python guy who's writing all his stuff in Python and you have somebody who's writing all her stuff in LabVIEW, it's really hard for them to share code, first of all, which is a huge issue. And then it's also hard if one of them leaves the company or wins the lottery or whatever, or is out for a week, you know, on vacation, to move developers around to different projects. And so we recommend that orgs should pick 1, 2 programming languages, settle on those, and that should be the standard moving forward, and then come up with style guides for those programming languages. And we have ways of doing that, right? Processes for helping them decide those things. So, and then looking at what tools you can make or write to make development faster. For example, if you're doing LabVIEW, You can write project templates where if you see a lot of, let's say you have a hardware abstraction layer and people are adding new instruments to that hardware abstraction layer on a continual basis, maybe you can have project templates that make it super fast so that everything's set up so that they can just throw down that project template, add their new instrument, override the methods they need to, and away they go, right? So questions on this? How much time we got? 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10, 15 minutes.
Cool. Hardware. One thing that we did at L3 Harris that I really liked, that we've kind of adopted as well with a lot of our customers, is coming up with a standard equipment list. It's easier to, like, if what I always say is when these test engineers go to lunch with the Rhodey and Schwartz guy, all of a sudden they've switched over to a new, I'm nothing against Rhodey and Schwartz, but let's say you've been using Keysight instruments forever, and then all of a sudden this engineer starts using Rhodey and Schwartz, or this guy starts using NI, and I'm not arguing one way for any or another for any of these, equipment manufacturers. But if you can standardize on certain equipment, for example, this is our spectrum analyzer that we use, or this is our power meter, these are our power supplies that we use for our company, several things happen. One, it's easier to have spares on hand because you can pillage from test sets that aren't being used potentially, or you can it's easier to justify having spares because now you have 30 test sets out there that use the same power meter. You can have one of those on hand for all of those. Whereas if each of them are using different power meters, you might have to have 30 different power meters on hand, right? It's easier to refactor test sets because you can reuse a lot of the same stuff from test sets. The other thing is on the software side, it makes software a lot easier because you don't have to rewrite the interfaces to those or reuse the interfaces to those pieces of hardware. And so it makes development go faster there. Another thing is you can get discounts with vendors potentially. If you're buying a lot more with that vendor, you can go and say, we want a discount on these because we're buying hundreds of them, as opposed to we're buying 5 from this vendor, 5 from this vendor, 5 from that vendor, So another recommendation we have is only have one person order all of the hardware. They're good at doing that. Test engineers tend to waste a lot of time on first of all, creating relationships with equipment vendors, and then browsing through catalogs and ordering parts, right? If you have one person who's just really good at it, I always recommend people have the lab manager do that. And that person can be the one that orders all of those parts, that you're going to have a better situation because they create that relationship with all these vendors. They know what's out there. They know exactly the process to use. They've got it down. It's not every engineer on your team has to come up with their own way of ordering parts now. And then that person can own the lab. They can own all of the spares. They can own all of the tools. It just makes in my opinion, a better experience. So there's some other tips and tricks we also have when we talk about hardware with people, such as test fixture design. What does that look like? That process. You go through that as well when you come up with your overall process. So individual growth. Again, this is the one that I always think gets overlooked. One of the things you can identify when you have your process down is what are your ceilings? Like really what that means is how far can Joe go in his career in our organization? What is his ceiling? Right? Is he going to hit a point and get bored? And we'll look at this on the next slide. But what can we do as an organization to increase that ceiling? Or is that just not in our wheelhouse as an organization? Are we just saying that this is the highest level of proficiency that we need, and we're not going to help people grow beyond that proficiency, right? And so those are things that you would identify during this process. We have a bunch of training that we offer, specifically onboard training, some advanced training through Test Point Academy and IHAS training. There's project management training out there. There's other, I know Rody and Schwartz has a series of trainings that you can potentially look at for individual growth, right? You can bring those trainings into your organization and say, we're gonna train, these developers on these trainings, and we expect everyone on our team to know this or to go through this training. Another thing that we did at L3 Harris that I really liked is we created different tiers for developers, and they had different gates to advance to these different tiers. The advantage of doing that is it gives people a path as well as something to strive for. If you're just saying you're a test engineer, we'll have your annual review next year, and we'll talk about moving you up to whatever the company's put out there. That's great, and that gives them, financial achievements. But if you have internal ones, you have internal trainings or trainings that you've picked off the shelf from other companies, you can grow those people, and it gives them something to strive for.
Yeah. So as long as those things are published or transparent, then it becomes a great growth opportunity or a career development tool that you can use to grow your team by saying, here's where you are right now, but we want you to be able to grow and look at all these opportunities that you have. Here's some trainings you can take. Here's projects that you can work on, so on and so forth.
Yeah. One thing we do in our company is we have 30 plus engineers at Tesseract. And so every Monday we have a team collaboration where different individuals get to present on something they're working on. And that helps us see and learn from each other. I think that's really important that we learn from each other, and it makes us feel more like a team because we're teaching each other and we're learning from each other and we're showing each other what we're doing. And so instituting something like that in your organization, I think, is very valuable. I know there's a good friend of mine, James Nichols. He works for L3 Harris in Mason, Ohio. He runs a monthly user group, and it's super successful. And everyone gets to come and partake and present on. And it's specifically about using LabVIEW, but it's really great for the team out there to do that. So this is something that one of my old managers, his name is Steve Kauser, he showed me that I've always really enjoyed, and I've thought a lot about this flow chart. I call it the flow zone. Basically, the idea is that with individual growth, you want people to be in the zone. You want your individuals to be in the zone. If they're highly skilled and you're giving them, tedious type work, they're going to get too bored. If they're underskilled and you're giving them complex work, they're going to be too overwhelmed and they're going to shut down potentially, right? And so you want the complexity of work that you're assigning to people to match their skill level. At the same time, you want to increase that skill level and increase that complexity of work so that they're always feeling valued, right? And people are the happiest when they're in this zone. They're in this flow zone where their skill level matches, or might be a little on the low side of their flow, right? And so this is a good way to map out everyone on your team and see where they are, and that will also identify what you can do to increase their skill levels, and maybe you're not stretching them enough with the type of work that you're assigning, right?
One of the other advantages to something like this is it not only shows you like skill development opportunities for people on your team, but you can augment those skill deficiencies through things like mentoring. So you could potentially use others outside the organization or some of these that fall into that 2 board category to help make up that gap and help people get into that zone if they are overwhelmed with the complexity of work that they have to deal with.
Yep. So, I mean, we've only got less than a minute here, so I'm just gonna kind of zip through this last piece. But
ultimately here though, like if you go back that one slide, the whole point of us talking about all these things that we look at from a strategic perspective is so that we can create a custom strategy for development for a team or a specific organization.
Yeah.
And that might look like some of these things on this action plan.
Right. So this action plan is going to say, okay, here's what we need to do. We want to create a dot chart. We want to do role definition. We want to build a how. We want to do these things. You kind of identify how expensive it is really to implement that, who's responsible for it, the priority, how important it is. And if there's stuff that you can purchase off on the market, right? You say, oh, we can just use Bitbucket. That's already good for us to use for source code control. Our org already subscribes to that, but setting it up is going to take some time, and the action plan can then be used in this act phase, which I'm just going to go through really quickly. It's putting together milestones, who's going to do what, and eventually you'll have some kind of Gantt chart, right, put together that can say, okay, step one, we're going to adopt these three, practices on our organization. The project lead is going to manage those, and in a year and a half, we're going to be at this point, and our team's going to be a rock star team at 1.5 years down the road, because these things take time, right?
Yeah, I think that's very important to mention. This isn't something that you're going to turn around in 60 days.
No.
Like these things take a lot of time.
Yeah. And then the last one's maintenance, right? Just keeping up with industry standards, identifying new trainings out there, reviewing the progress that people are making. And we sit down with teams, every quarter and kind of talk to them about how things are going, where they are, what that looks like, and kind of help consult them on a lot of this stuff, right, over time. So in short, the value, I hopefully you can see the value that something like this can bring to an organization. And we've seen it with our customers. I've seen it in companies I worked at. Just this one alone, the improved morale is big, because just that individual growth, that individual investment is huge. It reduces that attrition rate dramatically, and it makes people feel valued. So in summary, any questions? We lose everybody. They're all like, yeah. All right. Feel free to check out our website. Contact us if you do have any further questions.
And ultimately, we hope that you take away that team development or individual growth on teams, and especially related to test and measurement, is something that both Sam and I are really passionate about, and we're excited to be able to potentially partner with you going forward and make your teams even better.
Yep. Cool. Thanks, everyone.